I have interpreted my mission here as what is my responsibility in the classroom. So I'm thinking now specifically about one of the contexts Linda mentioned, which is my responsibility, or to what extent is this an issue that I feel obliged to raise within my teaching context. Before I go on, I do want to thank Van Goss for organizing this panel and doing it, so on such short notice. Linda and I did talk about the fact that there seems to be an over-representation of NYU on this panel, but when you're organizing things, kind of on the fly, it's hard to make sure you have every kind of diversity one might want. So, but you
have Hofstra on the panel.
No, there are other institutions. Okay. So basically, I'm not only approaching this as a question about teaching, but also a question about teaching for somebody who does Latin American history. All my courses are either on Brazil or Latin America. I don't teach any courses that don't mainly or largely deal with Latin America. So it's a very different question for me than it is for Joel or for Lena, too. And I also want to say, given that context, that it's my experience that undergraduates really don't like you to take time out from a class on, say, Brazil to talk about the Israel-Palestinian conflict, that they tend to get irritated and annoyed. And so the question is, I assume we're not talking about obligation, and particularly in this narrow context that I'm placing it in, we're not talking about obligation in terms of a moral obligation to do what's right in some abstract ethical sense. We're not talking, in the case of teaching, about speaking truth to power. We're talking about our students, who might someday actually be in positions of power, but most of them probably not. Most of them are worried about getting a job. I don't think about this as I should talk about it because I have an obligation to do it under any circumstances, or that I should do it because it would make me feel more righteous by doing it. I think I'm thinking about it in political terms. Is it politically efficacious for me to talk about this in the classroom? And if so, how would I talk about it in a way that would be politically effective? And I mean politically in a very broad sense of helping my students, going back to the idea of having certain habits of mind, certain capacity for critical thinking that will allow them, I hope, to begin to process certain issues in a way, I suppose, that I think will lead to a more peaceful and ethical world. So, so that's my framework. It's not sort of like, I feel an obligation to get up there and talk. If I feel that getting up there and talking about it is only going to make my students even more unlikely to be sympathetic to the position I adopt, then I'm not going to do it. It's a politically bad decision to do it. So, in effect, what I would argue is that my inclination is to figure out ways to talk about it without saying, today in your course on Brazil, we're going to be just addressing the Israel-Palestine question. Similarly, I didn't set aside class time to address the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson or the death of Eric Garner at the hands of the police in nearby Staten Island. But in talking about police violence in Brazil, in my course on Brazil, and growing outrage at the deaths of unarmed civilians, many of them Brazilians of African descent, I tried to discuss it in a way that would help the students think about this issue beyond the Brazilian context. So in effect, that's my theme, is that how to talk about things in a context that the students are expecting, but that will help them think about certain related issues in a more critical way. So what can a Latin Americanist do to help students think more critically about US support for Israel, the Palestinian struggle, etc.? What habits of mind can a Latin Americanist encourage? What kinds of knowledge can we circulate to our students that will help them in that regard? Those who teach, let me say, in addition to everything else, I'm a modern Latin Americanist. Those who teach about colonial Latin America and the Iberian Empire inevitably touch on the many centuries of the Muslim presence on the peninsula before and during the so-called Reconquest. Aside from the many features of Al-Andalus, with which the students are often not familiar. One would want to emphasize that the position of non-Muslims, including a very large Jewish population, indicate no particular ethno-religious incompatibility between Jews and Muslims. And of course, I know there's long debates about this, but I think that in general, I would say that, make that generalization. Our students, as we all know, often have a shallow vision of history and can easily fall into a notion of ancient hatreds. So I think the shallowness of their historical knowledge then produces this notion of ancient hatreds, which might seem contradictory, but I think most of us are actually familiar with this. That these are conflicts and enmities that have always existed, and so they're irresolvable, and therefore, and also no need to think about them historically, because the history is always the same. So I think one of the things that Latin Americanists can do by talking about the period before basically Christian Spain and Portugal retook the empire, the peninsula, and then created the empire, is to think in terms of the greater diversity and the relative compatibility of these different religious groups, ethno-religious groups during that period. Speaking of the use of familiar tropes to construct irreconcilable differences, which therefore are used to justify any and all actions taken by Israel to survive as a Jewish state, we have that very teachable moment offered to us in July 2012 by Mitt Romney, then candidate for president, when he visited Israel and declared that culture makes all the difference, quoting, let me say directly, David S. Landis's The Wealth and Poverty of Nations. So in explaining why Israel was so rich and no, well, he wouldn't have said Palestine, but the Palestinians were so poor. Aside from a critique of this use of culture being a regular theme, I think, in virtually all history courses that anyone in this room would be teaching, and there are, let me say, 100 different ways to critique Romney's remark, it also created a perfect moment to discuss the striking similarities in the role of Palestinian and Jewish immigrants in Latin America, particularly those that migrated to Latin America before World War II, with many Palestinian families distinguishing themselves in commerce and industry and being praised by developmentalists for their entrepreneurial tendencies. Whether we want to praise entrepreneurial immigrants or not, the striking similarities between certain Jews, and let me say mainly Jews from North Africa and the Middle East, and certain Palestinians, most of them were Palestinian Christians, so we can already see that the two groups, Jews and Palestinians, are problematic categories. In terms of their socioeconomic position in Latin America, certainly cast doubt on any larger generalization about culture making all the difference. But what I would really like to convey to my students is a way to think critically about this ad that appeared just 11 days ago in the New York Times, sponsored by, to me, previously unknown Rabbi Shmuley and Stand With Us. It is, I would say, from a strictly political point of view, a brilliant ad. Because I don't know if you can all see it. I'm sure many of you did see it. Let me say this is a full-page ad going back to the immense resources available. Shows a young man who says he's not Jewish, but he is gay, and that Israel is the only place in the Middle East where he wouldn't be immediately tortured or killed for being gay. This is, again, a brilliant ad from a strictly political point of view. I'm sure it is motivated by the concern that younger people, Jewish and non-Jewish, are increasingly critical, are increasingly willing to be critical of Israel and to be sympathetic to Palestine and to the Palestinians, and so therefore appealing to an issue that they also know young people are very sympathetic to, which is LGBT rights. And so I think this is the kind of thing that is most difficult in a way to get students to think about critically and to hopefully contextualize the message in a way that doesn't lead them to say, oh, well, yes, then you know, Israel is okay because they protect gay rights. What I would do as a historian is bring the broader issue of the way into the classroom, the broader issue, and I do this all the time, of the way imperial projects and other projects of domination have been sustained in the past by claims to greater respect for example, women's rights. So I'm thinking here of Antoinette Burton's path-breaking work, Burdens of History, on the role of British feminists in the British imperial project in India, and their construction of the oppressed Indian woman as a basis for their fuller participation in that imperial project. This is, of course, a challenging issue in many ways, starting with the problem of reasoning by analogy. And I think we have to maintain a delicate balance between critiquing this kind of use of a sort of civilization discourse, that we are the more civilized, and we being whoever sponsored this, and at the same time not wanting to seem dismissive of LGBT rights. Here again, there are many different ways to critique the simplistic reasoning in this ad. But as a Latin Americanist, I would draw on the long history of the US claiming to bring democracy or women's rights or some other supposedly civilizing benefit to Latin America or the Philippines, even as the United States was bolstering or creating certain hierarchies and inequalities or engaging directly or indirectly in brutalizing wars of counterinsurgency. Thank you.